A small-town diner, a missing wallet, a town full of secrets. When Shaquille O'Neal stops for a quiet meal, he walks into more than just suspicion. He walks into a past that refuses to stay buried. Whispers turn to accusations, lies unravel, and as the truth surfaces, so do the ghosts of a town built on injustice. One night, one confrontation, one moment that changes everything. Big Shaq walks into a diner. What happens next? Shocks everyone. Some towns welcome strangers. This one? It never forgets. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The road stretched long and empty, slicing through fields of dried-up grass and forgotten farmland. The late afternoon sun hung low, painting the sky in muted golds and soft oranges, casting elongated shadows across the cracked pavement. A lone vehicle, a sleek black SUV, rumbled down the two-lane highway, its tires humming a steady rhythm against the asphalt. Behind the wheel sat Shaquille O'Neal, or as most knew him, Big Shaq, a giant of a man, yet a gentle soul, his presence both commanding and oddly comforting. Shaq wasn't the type to seek attention. Despite his fame, his wealth, and his towering stature, he preferred moments like these. Driving alone, the world quiet except for the low hum of the radio and the distant chirping of cicadas. He had passed through countless towns over the years, each with its own story, its own secrets buried beneath layers of time. This town, however, felt different. A weathered sign appeared on the roadside. "Welcome to Millbrook, a town with a proud history." The words seemed innocent enough, but Shaq had seen enough of America to recognize the unspoken meaning behind small-town slogans. Proud history could mean anything. Sometimes it meant unity, resilience. Other times it was a polite way of masking a history of division. As he crossed the town's threshold, the air seemed to shift. It wasn't obvious, not outright hostility, but there was something about the way people moved, the way they watched strangers for a second too long. The town was small, its main street lined with mom-and-pop shops, a hardware store, a gas station with an ancient-looking pump, and a single-story diner with a flickering neon sign that read, "Edith's Place." The sign buzzed faintly as it struggled to stay lit, as if the diner itself had grown tired over the years. Shaq pulled into the gravel lot, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment. Millbrook wasn't the kind of place he'd normally stop. There was something in the air, something just beneath the surface. But he was hungry, and he never ignored his instincts, good or bad. He stepped out all 7 feet, 1 inch of him, unfolding from the SUV like a moving monument. The moment his shoes crunched against the gravel, the first set of eyes turned toward him. Then another. Conversations slowed. A couple of teenagers hanging out near the gas station stopped mid-laugh, their heads tilting in curiosity. Shaq was used to being noticed. That came with the territory. But this wasn't the usual excitement or admiration. This was something else. A guarded curiosity. A test, maybe. He took a breath, adjusted the chain around his neck, and walked inside the diner. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, bacon grease, and something vaguely sweet, maybe pie. The place was straight out of another time, red vinyl booths, a long counter with chrome bar stools, and a jukebox in the corner that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. The walls were lined with old photos, black and white portraits of Millbrook's past, a silent reminder of who built this town and who had been allowed to belong. A bell above the door jingled, announcing his arrival. He ducked slightly to step inside, a habit ingrained from years of navigating spaces never built for someone his size. For a brief moment, no one spoke. A waitress, middle-aged, with tired eyes and a name tag that read Bev, stood behind the counter, a coffee pot frozen in her grip. A group of older men in flannel shirts sat at a booth near the window, their conversation halting mid-sentence. A younger couple in the corner exchanged a look. The only person who didn't react was an old man sitting alone at the counter, stirring his coffee with slow, deliberate movements. Shaq gave a small nod. "How's it going?" His voice, deep and warm, filled the space. Bev blinked as if snapping out of a trance. Seat yourself, hun. Coffee's fresh." He chose a booth near the back, settling in as best as he could. The vinyl creaked under his weight. He grabbed the plastic menu from the table and glanced through it. The usual small-town diner fare: burgers, fries, meatloaf special, homemade peach cobbler. From the corner of his eye, he caught a teenage boy at the counter stealing glances at him. The kid couldn't have been older than 16. Skinny, with an oversized hoodie. That seemed to swallow him whole. He leaned toward the old man, whispering something. The old man nodded, barely reacting. Shaq exhaled slowly. He'd been in places like this before. He knew the signs, the quiet stares, the hesitation, the cautious hospitality that never felt quite real. He wasn't here to start anything, but he wasn't naive either. Bev walked over, notebook in hand. "Know what you want?" Shaq offered her a smile, genuine but measured. "Yeah, cheeseburger, fries, and I'll take that peach cobbler I saw on the menu." She scribbled it down. "Drink?" "Just water." She nodded, pausing for half a second as if debating whether to say something. Then with a small, almost imperceptible sigh, she walked away. As Shaq waited, the low hum of conversation returned, but it was different now, muted, cautious. He could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. The old man at the counter finally looked up from his coffee. His eyes were sharp, clouded by age but still holding something knowing. He studied Shaq for a long moment before speaking. "You ain't from around here." It wasn't a question. Shaq leaned back, meeting his gaze. "Nope." The man stirred his coffee again, slow and deliberate. "Didn't think so." The teenage boy beside him looked between them, curiosity and something else flickering across his face. Bev reappeared with Shaq's food, placing it down with practiced ease. "Here you go, hun." Shaq nodded in thanks and reached for the burger. The first bite was good, better than expected. Juicy, well-seasoned, the kind of meal that stuck with you. He ate slowly, aware of every glance, every whisper, every shifting movement in the diner. Outside, the sky was beginning to change, the golden glow of afternoon giving way to the deeper hues of approaching dusk. The neon sign outside flickered again, struggling to hold on. Something about this place felt off, not in an obvious way, not in a way he could put into words just yet. But he knew better than to ignore his gut. The old man kept watching him, not with malice, not even suspicion, just observation. Then finally he spoke again. "Be careful in this town, son." Shaq paused mid-bite, his jaw tightening slightly. He swallowed, placing the burger down. "That's so," he said, voice calm, unreadable. The old man didn't smile, didn't blink, just lifted his cup and took another slow sip of coffee. "Yeah," he said. "That's so." And just like that, the feeling in Shaq's gut tightened. This wasn't just another diner in another town. This place had a history, and he had just walked right into the middle of it. The sound of Shaq's fork scraping against the plate felt louder than it should have. The diner wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. A handful of patrons occupied the booths and stools, some lingering over coffee, others picking at their food. Yet despite the quiet hum of conversation, the air felt tight, stretched too thin, like a thread pulled to its limit. Shaq kept his posture relaxed, his focus on his meal, but he could feel it. The weight of eyes on him, glances exchanged, whispers just below hearing. This wasn't his first time stepping into a place where he was the only one who looked like him, and it sure wouldn't be the last. The teenage boy at the counter was still sneaking glances at him, but it was the old man beside him who had Shaq's attention. The man had a presence, not loud, not obvious, but steady, like a storm sitting just over the horizon, waiting. His cup of coffee was nearly empty, yet he kept stirring it with a slow, deliberate motion, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. His gaze never wavered. From the corner of the diner, a woman with graying hair and deep-set lines on her face leaned in to whisper to her husband. The man, wiry and weathered, barely moved his lips as he responded. At another table, a trucker with grease-stained hands took a slow sip of coffee, his eyes drifting toward Shaq, then back to his plate. Not outright hostility, but something close. Bev, the waitress, moved with mechanical efficiency, her steps brisk, her focus sharp. When she returned to refill Shaq's water, her hands were steady, but there was a flicker of hesitation in the way she set the pitcher down. "You need anything else, hun?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Shaq met her gaze, searching for something in her expression. Fear, uncertainty, maybe even guilt. There was something there, but she masked it well. "Nah," he said. "I'm good." She gave a quick nod and moved away, but Shaq didn't miss the way her shoulders tensed as she passed by the man sitting alone near the kitchen window. The one who hadn't looked at him once, but whose grip on his coffee mug had tightened the second Shaq walked in. Shaq didn't know his name, but he knew his type. The owner. The way the other employees subtly avoided his path. The way his eyes stayed fixed on the counter, as if looking up might mean acknowledging something he didn't want to face. The way the air shifted when he moved. The quiet discomfort that followed him like a shadow. Shaq had seen enough of America to recognize the unspoken rules of certain places. The door swung open with a soft chime, and a young woman entered, wind-blown and breathless, carrying a small child on her hip. She looked around quickly before hurrying toward a booth near the back. The baby, maybe 2 years old, let out a soft whimper before settling his head against her shoulder. A few of the regulars glanced up but quickly looked away. She wasn't part of their world either. Shaq caught Bev's subtle shift in stance. A quick glance between her and the diner owner. A flicker of something in their exchange. Annoyance? Worry? "She gonna get served?" Shaq asked, keeping his voice low but firm. Bev hesitated, just for a breath before forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Course, hun, just give it a minute." Shaq leaned back, letting the words settle. "That a usual thing around here?" Bev pressed her lips together and sighed, running a hand down the front of her apron. "Just depends on the day." Shaq nodded slowly. He'd heard enough. The old man at the counter finally spoke, his voice rough like gravel but steady. "You ever been to a place like this before?" he asked, still stirring his empty cup of coffee. Shaq set his fork down. "A place like what?" The old man let out a slow breath, as if considering whether it was worth saying. "A place where folks don't forget easy." Shaq didn't answer right away. He knew what the man was really asking. "You saying people here got long memories?" Shaq said finally. The man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Something like that." Shaq exhaled through his nose, considering his words. "That why they're looking at me like I don't belong?" The old man didn't flinch, didn't shift, just watched. "Ain't about belonging," he said. "It's about what's been passed down, what gets carried." Shaq studied him for a moment, taking in the lines on his face, the way his hands, weathered and veined, rested on the counter. This man had seen things, lived through them. Before Shaq could respond, the diner owner finally spoke. "You done eatin'?" The words weren't outright rude, but they weren't polite either. Just a thin layer of civility stretched over something much uglier. Shaq turned his head slowly, meeting the man's gaze for the first time. The owner was in his 50s, maybe 60s, with a thick build and a permanent scowl carved into his face. His eyes, though, those told the real story. Shaq had seen that look before. Not anger, not even resentment. Fear. And fear made people dangerous. He held the man's gaze for a long moment, the silence between them growing heavier. Then, with measured ease, Shaq picked up his glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it back down. "Not yet," he said. The diner owner exhaled sharply through his nose, nostrils flaring slightly. He wasn't used to being challenged. Shaq let the moment stretch just long enough to make his point before reaching for his burger again, taking another deliberate bite. The message was clear. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. Across the room, the young mother was still waiting, bouncing the child gently on her knee. The baby let out another soft sound, rubbing at his eyes, his tiny fingers curling against her sleeve. Shaq sighed, shaking his head slightly. Then, making up his mind, he waved Bev over again. She hesitated, then walked back to his table, notebook in hand. "Something else?" "Yeah," Shaq said. "Bring her whatever she wants. On me." Bev's lips parted slightly, her fingers tightening around the pen. For a second, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right." She turned away, heading toward the young woman's booth. The diner owner watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. The teenage boy at the counter had stopped whispering. Even the old man had stopped stirring his coffee. Shaq wiped his hands on a napkin, then leaned back against the booth, stretching his arms slightly. For the first time since he'd walked into the diner, the place was completely silent. No one quite knew what to do with him. And that, Shaq realized, might have been the most telling thing of all. The tension in the diner hadn't eased. If anything, it had settled into something more insidious. Quiet judgment, unspoken assumptions, slow-burning unease. It clung to the walls, soaked into the floorboards, hung in the air like cigarette smoke from a bygone era. Shaq had felt it before. In different towns, different places, under different circumstances. Some places let the past go. Others held onto it with both hands. The murmurs started small, just a few hushed voices at a nearby booth, followed by stolen glances from the trucker at the counter. Then, like ripples in still water, the whispers spread. "Looks familiar, don't he?" "Yeah, but what's he doing here?" "Maybe just passing through." Or maybe not. Shaq didn't react. He focused on his food, chewing slowly, letting the words drift past him like background noise. He knew better than to give them life by acknowledging them. People like this loved to push, to test, to see if they could get a rise out of you. He wasn't going to play into it. But then, from the farthest corner of the diner, a voice cut through the whispers. Sharpened, deliberate. "Lot of folks come through here thinking they own the place." The words weren't loud, but they carried. The diner quieted just enough for them to land exactly where they were meant to. Shaq set his fork down and exhaled slowly before turning his head toward the voice. The speaker was a young man, maybe early 20s, slouched in the booth with an untouched cup of coffee in front of him. Lean, wiry, with restless energy twitching in his fingers. He drummed his knuckles against the tabletop, eyes locked on Shaq with something between defiance and challenge. The waitress, Bev, tensed as she passed him, deliberately avoiding eye contact. The old man at the counter, the one who had been silently watching since Shaq walked in, finally shifted in his seat. He let out a slow sigh, lifting his cup to his lips before speaking. "You should mind your mouth, kid," he said, voice gravelly but firm. The young man's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the old man but didn't back down. "I'm just saying," the kid muttered. "Ain't every day you see someone like him walk in here, like he don't got a care in the world." Shaq met the young man's gaze and held it, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to respond. Silence, when used right, was more powerful than any comeback. The old man at the counter let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. He set his cup down with a soft clink and turned slightly toward Shaq. "This town ain't kind to outsiders," he said, his tone laced with something deeper than just a casual warning. He paused, then added, "Especially ones like you." Shaq's fingers curled slightly against the table. "That right?" he said, voice even. The old man didn't blink. "That's right." The diner seemed to shrink around them, the edges of the room pulling in close. Every eye was on them now. The young man in the booth smirked, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. The old man sighed again and leaned back, rubbing a hand over his chin. His knuckles were gnarled, his skin weathered. "Ain't about you," he said finally. "Not exactly. It's about what you remind folks of." Shaq studied him, the meaning settling in. "You saying they got ghosts?" Shaq asked. The old man let out another dry chuckle. "Something like that." The young man in the booth scoffed and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Man, you don't know nothing." The old man gave him a slow look, the kind that made men twice his size straighten up. "I know more than you, boy. And that's a fact." The young man's smirk twitched, but he didn't say anything. Shaq let his gaze drift around the diner. The waitress was pretending to wipe down a counter she'd already cleaned. The trucker at the front had gone still, listening. The woman with the baby sat stiff-backed, eyes flicking between Shaq and the old man, like she was waiting for the next move in a chess game she didn't want to be part of. "So tell me," Shaq said, keeping his tone neutral. "What do I remind folks of?" The old man tapped his fingers against his coffee cup, considering. You ever hear about the old mill fire? Shaq shook his head. Course not, the old man muttered. Most folks don't talk about it no more. From the corner, the young man stiffened. His fingers clenched into fists against the table. The old man noticed but continued. Back in the day, Millbrook had one of the biggest cotton mills in the county, he said. Kept the town running, gave folks work. But there were rules, see? And not everybody got the same chances. The silence in the diner deepened. One night fire broke out, the old man said, voice quieter now. Nobody ever figured out how it started, or at least, that's what they say. Burned half the place to the ground. Killed 3 men. Men who worked harder than anybody but weren't ever really welcome here. Shaq didn't need him to say it outright. He understood. The young man in the booth suddenly stood, shoving his chair back with a screech. Man, shut up, he snapped. Ain't nobody care about none of that. The old man turned his head slightly. You do. The kid's jaw tightened. His hands twitched at his sides. He looked at Shaq again, then back at the old man. You don't know nothin', he muttered before shoving past the tables and storming out of the diner. The door slammed shut behind him, sending a shiver through the walls. Shaq let the silence settle before speaking. He got something to do with it. The old man took a slow sip of coffee, his fingers steady. Everybody in this town got something to do with it. Shaq exhaled, letting the words sink in. The old man glanced at the clock on the wall. Sun's going down soon. You might want to think about moving along. Shaq looked at him. That another warning? The old man met his gaze, unreadable. Call it advice. Shaq nodded slowly, pushing his plate aside. He reached for his wallet, but the old man shook his head. Don't worry about it, he said. Consider it payment for listening. Shaq hesitated, then gave a small nod of thanks. As he stood, he caught the waitress watching him, her expression unreadable. As he made his way toward the door, he felt every pair of eyes on him again, just like when he walked in. But this time, the weight of their stares was heavier. He stepped outside, into the cooling evening air. The sun was beginning to sink behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the pavement. The young man from the booth was nowhere to be seen. Shaq glanced back through the diner's window one last time. The old man was still sitting there, stirring his coffee. And for the first time since Shaq had arrived in Millbrook, he realized something. That man hadn't been watching him out of curiosity. He'd been watching out for him. The sound cut through the diner like a blade, a sharp, panicked scream, high-pitched, desperate. My wallet! It's gone. The diner froze. Every conversation, every scrape of a fork against a plate, every movement stopped in an instant. The woman, middle-aged blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, stood near the counter, frantically patting the pockets of her coat. Her eyes darted across the room, wide with panic. It was right here, she said, breathless. I just had it when I paid for my coffee. A murmur spread through the diner, low but charged with something dangerous. The kind of energy that could flip from suspicion to accusation in an instant. Shaq exhaled slowly, already knowing where this was going before it even started. Then, right on cue. You sure you didn't see anything? The voice belonged to a man in a flannel shirt sitting 2 booths away. He was looking straight at Shaq, his brows furrowed, his lips pressed together like he was trying to seem reasonable. But the weight behind his words told the real story. Shaq didn't respond. Didn't even blink. The woman hesitated, glancing toward Shaq, her fingers still digging through her purse. Her expression wavered, but she didn't correct the man. Another voice chimed in. Yeah, he got up a minute ago, didn't he? Walked right past where she was standing. It was the trucker at the counter this time, his voice casual, as if he were just making an observation. Shaq felt his jaw tighten. Now, hold on. Bev, the waitress, cut in quickly, stepping forward. Let's not... I didn't say he did it, the trucker interrupted, raising his hands in mock innocence. Just... makes you think, don't it? And that was it. The seed was planted, a shift in the air. A silent agreement passed between certain people in the room. Ones who were already looking for a reason, already waiting for an excuse. The old man at the counter hadn't moved. He was still stirring his coffee, slow, methodical. But his eyes were locked on Shaq now, sharp and knowing. The young man from the booth, the one who'd challenged Shaq earlier, suddenly reappeared near the entrance. His arms were crossed, his stance casual, but there was a flicker of something in his gaze. Not quite satisfaction, not quite surprise either. Shaq let out a long, controlled breath and finally spoke, his voice steady. "You think I took it?" Nobody answered immediately. The hesitation was enough of an answer. The woman's face flushed. She was still searching her bag, flipping through every pocket. I don't know. It was just here, and now it's not. And she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Shaq could already hear the next part in his head. And you were the only one who doesn't belong here. He glanced around the room, at the half-hearted shrugs, the looks exchanged, the silent agreement between those who wouldn't say the words outright, but didn't mind if someone else did. He'd seen this before, lived it before. A memory surfaced, a different place, a different time. A department store when he was barely a teenager. A security guard trailing him down the aisles, watching him like a hawk while other kids browsed freely. The way the store manager asked, "You sure you don't have anything in your pockets?" With that same forced politeness. The way his mother's face had gone tight, her voice sharp as steel when she said, "He's got nothing, and you know it." Shaq let out a slow breath through his nose, pushing the memory back. "I didn't take your wallet," he said simply. A heavy silence followed. The woman shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't looking at Shaq now. Her eyes darted to the others in the room, as if waiting for someone to speak for her, to decide for her. The diner owner, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, wiping his hands on a towel. His eyes flicked toward Shaq, assessing. "Ain't nobody accusing you," he said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "But it'd be a whole lot easier if you just let us check your pockets." Shaq felt something twist in his chest. Not anger, not yet, but something close. He stared at the diner owner, his expression unreadable. "You serious?" "It's just to clear things up," the man continued, forcing a smile. "That way, no hard feelings." Shaq's fingers curled slightly against the table. No hard feelings. That was the real joke, wasn't it? They'd already made up their minds. Even if the wallet turned up somewhere else, it wouldn't change the way they saw him. It never did. And the worst part? He could already feel it happening. That old, familiar exhaustion creeping in. The weight of having to prove himself. Again. The old man at the counter finally spoke. "Don't do it, son." The room turned toward him. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice. But the authority in his tone cut through the tension like a blade. "You don't owe nobody a damn thing," he said. "And you know it." A thick silence followed. The old man's fingers tapped against his cup, slow and deliberate. The diner owner frowned. "Now, Hank, you want to search somebody?" The old man interrupted. "Start with the boy who ran out of here 10 minutes ago." Every head turned toward the young man in the hoodie, the one who had been sitting in the booth earlier, the one who had conveniently disappeared right before the woman screamed. The diner went completely still. Bev's eyes widened slightly. The trucker frowned. The woman hesitated, looking toward the door, as if suddenly realizing something. The old man let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Funny how folks never look in the right places first, huh?" Shaq didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as the shift unfolded. Doubt crept into the woman's face. She hesitated, then quickly turned back to her purse, flipping through it again. This time, actually searching instead of just assuming. And then, oh, a single word. She pulled out the wallet from the inner lining of her bag, her face flushing deep red. Silence. Heavy. Awkward. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Exactly like before. Exactly like always. The woman's mouth opened and closed. Her fingers curled around the wallet. She looked around, as if expecting someone to step in and save her from the moment. But nobody did. Finally, she swallowed hard and mumbled, "Guess I must have put it there without realizing." Shaq didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The weight of the moment hung in the air, pressing down on everyone. Bev cleared her throat, stepping back toward Shaq's table. "You need anything else, hun?" He met her eyes. For the first time since he walked in, she actually looked at him. Really looked. "Nah," he said, pushing his plate forward. "I'm done." And with that, he stood, stretched, and took one last glance around the diner. He saw the woman, still gripping her wallet like she wished she could disappear. The diner owner, avoiding his gaze. The trucker, suddenly very interested in his coffee. And the old man at the counter? He just gave Shaq a small nod, the kind that said, "I see you." Shaq nodded back. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. A heavy silence settled over the diner like a dust storm rolling in slow and suffocating. Shaq stood near his booth, arms relaxed at his sides, but inside something familiar churned. Not anger, not fear, just that same old exhaustion. The kind that came when people like him had to explain themselves in places like this. The woman who had accused him of stealing her wallet still stood near the counter, her face flushed. She clutched the leather wallet against her chest, fingers digging into it like she wished she could squeeze the moment out of existence. Nobody spoke. Not the trucker at the counter, not the older men near the window, not the diner owner, whose lips had pressed into a thin, unreadable line. And then, finally, a voice cut through the weight of it all. "You all should be ashamed." The words weren't loud, but they landed like a slap. Bev, the waitress, stood by the counter, arms crossed, her eyes hard and shining with something fierce. Shaq blinked. He hadn't expected that. She took a step forward, her shoes clicking against the tile. Man walks in, sits down, orders food like anybody else, and the second something goes missing, you all just... She shook her head, scoffing. "Jump to him?" A few of the patrons shifted uncomfortably. The woman who had screamed about her wallet flinched, hugging it closer. Bev wasn't finished. "I've been working here 10 years, she said, voice firm. "Seen all kinds come and go. Seen plenty walk out on the bill, plenty leave messes. Hell, seen a guy try to take off with the tip jar once." Her gaze swept the room, sharp and cutting. "And I ain't never seen none of all make a fuss about it like you just did." The trucker cleared his throat, looking down at his coffee. One of the older men near the window muttered something under his breath, but not loud enough for anyone to hear. Shaq stayed quiet, watching. Bev exhaled sharply, then turned toward him. "You didn't do it," she said, "and anybody with a damn brain knows it." The diner stayed silent. Then, a slow, deliberate sound filled the room, the soft clink of a spoon against ceramic. The old man at the counter, the one who had been watching Shaq since the moment he walked in, lifted his coffee and took a sip. Then, without looking up, he spoke. "You play ball, son." Shaq turned his head slightly. It wasn't the question he expected. "Yeah." The old man nodded, setting his cup down. "Figured. You move like an athlete. Got that patience about you." Shaq studied him now, really looked. The deep-set eyes, the way his fingers tapped a steady rhythm on the counter, the slight hunch in his shoulders that only came from years of coaching. "You a coach?" Shaq asked. The old man gave a small smirk. "Used to be. Long time ago." Something in his tone hinted at a story. One Shaq suspected had a lot more weight than he was letting on. The old man finally looked up, his gaze locking onto Shaq's. "I don't believe for a second you took that wallet," he said simply. "But I also know this town, and it ain't gonna let this go easy." A chill threaded through the diner, the kind that didn't come from the air conditioning. The trucker coughed. The woman with the wallet stared down at the floor. The diner owner took a step forward, clearing his throat. "All right, let's all settle down. It was a mistake. Ain't no need to drag this out." But the old man wasn't letting it go. "You got security cameras in here, don't you?" he asked, his voice casual but pointed. The diner owner's expression flickered, just for a second, but Shaq caught it. The trucker looked up. "Yeah," he muttered, rubbing his chin. "Don't you?" A fresh wave of tension rippled through the room. The young man in the hoodie, the one who had been throwing attitude since Shaq walked in, suddenly stiffened. His hands twitched against his sides, his eyes darting to the door. Shaq noticed. So did the old man. And so did Bev. She let out a slow exhale, shaking her head. I'll go get the footage. The diner owner hesitated. Bev. But she was already moving, disappearing behind the counter and through the kitchen doors. The young man licked his lips, his breathing shallow now. His knee bounced under the table, his fingers clenching. Shaq had seen this before. That nervous energy. The way someone looks right before they bolt. You in a hurry, kid? The old man asked, not even turning his head. The young man's nostrils flared. Man, I ain't got time for this. I got places to be. That right? Bev returned, holding a small tablet. She tapped the screen, her expression unreadable. Footage don't lie, she murmured. The young man shot to his feet. And just like that, every single person in the diner knew. The trucker exhaled sharply. The woman with the wallet let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to regret. The diner owner's lips pressed together. He already knew what the footage was going to show. Bev's eyes were cold now as she turned the tablet so everyone could see. A grainy video played on the screen. The woman in the tight bun, standing near the counter, laughing at something on her phone. Shaq, seated at his booth, nowhere near her. And then, the young man in the hoodie walking past her, his fingers slipping into the side pocket of her purse. The room stilled. Shaq didn't move. The young man's face drained of color. Man, this is bull, he stammered. The old man finally turned to face him fully. You want to keep lying, or you want to fix this? His voice was low, calm, dangerous in its steadiness. The young man's hands curled into fists, his jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring. For a moment, Shaq thought he was going to run. But then, his shoulders sagged. His fingers twitched, then slowly, reluctantly. He pulled the wallet from his hoodie pocket and placed it on the counter. No one spoke. The woman with the bun covered her mouth, her eyes wide with guilt. The trucker let out a slow whistle. Well, damn. Shaq inhaled deeply, then let it out. The weight in his chest didn't ease. It never really did. The young man swallowed hard, his eyes flicking up to meet Shaq's. He hesitated. I didn't mean... Shaq stared at him for a long moment. And then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the door. Bev watched him go, her expression unreadable. The old man simply shook his head, lifting his coffee again. As Shaq pushed open the door, the last thing he heard was the old man's voice, soft but firm. You best learn something from this, boy, 'cause next time you won't be this lucky. And then the diner door swung shut behind him. The wallet sat on the counter like a loaded gun. No one touched it. No one spoke. The weight of the truth, now undeniable, pressed down on the room. Shaq stood near the door, his shoulders squared, his face unreadable. He had been in this position before, wrongly accused, forced to prove himself, forced to be patient while others decided whether to give him the benefit of the doubt. But this time, he wasn't the only one under the microscope. The young man in the hoodie, caught, exposed, shaking in his own skin, kept his eyes down. His fingers twitched against his sides like he was fighting the urge to run but knew it wouldn't get him anywhere. The air around him crackled with something raw. Fear, anger, guilt. And then there was the diner owner. His face had gone pale, lips pressed together so tightly that the lines around his mouth looked carved into his skin. He wasn't just tense. He was afraid. That's when Shaq knew. There was more to this. Something deeper than a stolen wallet. Something that had been waiting to come to the surface for a long, long time. Bev still held the tablet in her hands. The security footage paused on the image of the young man slipping the wallet from the woman's purse. The proof was undeniable. But she wasn't looking at that anymore. Her eyes were locked on something else. Something farther back in the footage. Hold up, she muttered, her finger swiping across the screen. She stopped, sucked in a sharp breath. Oh, hell. The room tightened. Shaq took a step closer, his chest tightening, as he caught a glimpse of the frozen frame on the screen. It wasn't just the boy stealing the wallet. It was the diner owner, slipping something into the young man's hoodie pocket before he did it. A long, silent beat passed. Shaq exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. You want to explain that? The diner owner didn't move. His fingers twitched at his sides, his face unreadable except for the flicker of something dark in his eyes. Bev turned the tablet toward the rest of the diner. You see that? She asked, her voice sharp. He planted something on him, right before it happened. The trucker let out a low whistle. Well, damn. The woman with the bun shifted uncomfortably. But why would he? The young man lifted his head suddenly, his expression twisted, confused and angry at the same time. What the hell, man? His voice cracked, the edge of betrayal slicing through. For the first time since this whole thing started, the diner owner's mask cracked, just for a second. But it was enough. Shaq saw it. And so did the old man at the counter. The old man finally set his coffee cup down, his voice low and even. Because he needed you to take the fall. Another silence, thicker than before. The young man swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. For what? Shaq could already see the answer in the way the diner owner's eyes darted toward the door, like he was measuring his chances of making it out before the room turned on him. Not just the wallet, Shaq said. Something bigger. Bev flicked through the footage, her face going pale. Oh my God, she whispered. Shaq stepped closer, and there it was. Not just the diner owner slipping something into the kid's pocket. Something before that. Something outside. A grainy clip of the diner owner standing behind the building, talking to someone out of view. And then, a single frame where the person finally stepped into the light. The young man sucked in a sharp breath. His entire body locked up. Because the man in the footage, the one talking to the diner owner, was wearing a jacket with a familiar emblem stitched into the sleeve. An emblem Shaq had seen before. An emblem tied to a past that Millbrook had tried to bury. The old man at the counter let out a slow, weary sigh. Guess it was only a matter of time, he muttered. The diner owner finally moved. He turned toward the door. Shaq stepped in his path before he could take another step. Sit down, Shaq said, his voice low and steady. Now. The diner owner's jaw tightened. You don't get to tell me. Shaq took a half step forward, not threatening, just there. Unmovable. The diner owner hesitated. Then slowly, he sank into a chair. Bev turned the tablet around again, tapping the screen. Who's he talking to? She asked. The young man didn't answer. His fists clenched at his sides, his breathing shallow. The old man at the counter finally spoke again, his voice heavy. That's his father. The room went still. Shaq's stomach dropped. The young man's eyes snapped to the old man. You shut up, he said, but his voice wavered. The old man shook his head, rubbing a hand over his chin. Knew you looked familiar, he murmured. Your daddy was part of the crew that ran the old mill, wasn't he? The young man didn't answer. Didn't have to. Shaq exhaled slowly, the pieces finally clicking into place. This wasn't just about a stolen wallet. This was about the old mill fire, the one the old man had mentioned earlier. The one that had killed 3 men, 3 black men who had been workers there. The one that had never been properly investigated. And now, here was the diner owner, talking in the shadows with one of the men tied to that past. Shaq turned back to the young man. You didn't know, did you? He asked, voice quieter now. The kid swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. His fingers twitched at his sides. I don't. His voice cracked. He told me they were just looking out for me, all right? That they had my back. Shaq exhaled slowly. And finally the diner owner spoke. Boy, he muttered, shaking his head. You don't know a damn thing. The kid spun on him, eyes burning. You used me. His voice shook with something sharp, something raw. Of course he did, the old man muttered. That's what people like him do. The diner owner glared at him, but the fight had already left his body. He knew he was caught. Shaq turned back to the kid. You got a choice, he said. Keep going down the road they want you on, or start making your own. The young man's breath hitched. And then, finally, his shoulders slumped. His hands fell open at his sides, and for the first time since Shaq walked into this town, he looked lost. Like a boy who had been following a path his whole life, only to realize too late it was leading him off a cliff. The diner stayed silent, and then, without another word, the young man turned and walked out the door. No one stopped him. No one spoke. Shaq watched him go, his chest heavy, because he knew, whatever came next for that kid, it wasn't going to be easy, not in a town like this. The door swung shut behind the young man, leaving a silence so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Shaq remained still, his eyes fixed on the space where the kid had just stood. His mind was moving, working through the weight of everything that had unraveled in the past hour. The stolen wallet had been nothing but a match. The fire had been smoldering here for decades. The old mill fire. The words pressed into his ribs like a ghost's whisper. Shaq turned back to the diner. No one spoke. The truckers at the counter stared into their coffee cups like the bottom of them held answers. The woman with the bun twisted a napkin in her hands, her knuckles white. The diner owner sat stiffly, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet anyone else's. But it was the old man at the counter, Hank, who finally broke the silence. "Reckon it's about time this town stopped hiding from itself," he muttered. Shaq studied him. The lines on his face weren't just from age. They were from carrying something heavy for too long. Hank let out a slow breath and leaned back. "This ain't just about that boy. Ain't just about what happened today. This has been a long time coming." Bev stepped forward cautiously, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "What exactly happened with that fire?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Nobody ever really talks about it." The diner owner flinched. A barely there movement, but Shaq caught it. Hank nodded toward him. "Maybe you ought to ask him." The room turned. For the first time since the footage had been played, the diner owner finally met Shaq's gaze. There was something dark in his expression. Not anger, not exactly, but something close. "You think you know what happened?" he said, voice low, rough. Hank exhaled sharply. "I don't think. I know." The diner owner clenched his jaw. "It was an accident." Hank gave him a long, slow look. "Yeah? What had they told you?" Silence. Shaq folded his arms, watching the tension stretch between them. He wasn't from this town, didn't grow up in its shadows, but he knew this kind of story. A past that never got spoken about, except in whispers. A wound no one wanted to admit was still bleeding. Hank leaned forward, fingers tapping against the counter. "That mill fire killed 3 men, hard-working men, men who did their jobs better than anyone but still weren't allowed in the front offices. That fire didn't just happen, it was set." Shaq's chest tightened. He knew what was coming next. "By who?" Bev asked, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Hank's gaze flickered toward the diner owner. His grandfather, and a few others. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop. Shaq saw it then. The slight tremble in the diner owner's fingers, the way his breath hitched for a second too long. But it was the woman with the bun who spoke first. "But," she swallowed, "that was so long ago. Why bring it up now?" Shaq's stomach turned at the way she said it, like time erased the weight of a thing. Hank's voice was steady. "Because the past don't just disappear because you want it to, and because some of y'all still living in it, whether you say so or not." The diner owner let out a sharp breath. "That wasn't me." Hank didn't blink. "Number. But it was your blood. And you knew, didn't you?" Silence. Then finally the truth cracked through. The diner owner let out a long breath and dropped his head. "Yeah," he muttered. "I knew." Shaq exhaled through his nose. There it was. Bev took a step back, like the air had been knocked out of her. "Jesus," she whispered. The diner owner dragged a hand down his face. "I was a kid when it happened," he said, his voice rough. "By the time I was old enough to ask questions, it was already buried. People stopped talking about it. But I heard things. My old man, he let things slip when he drank too much." Hank nodded slowly. "And let me guess, some of those folks that helped cover it up? Still around. Still making sure the story doesn't get told the right way." The diner owner's silence was enough. Shaq studied him. He didn't see a monster sitting in front of him. He saw a man who had been raised in the shadow of something ugly, something he never fully questioned. Until now. The past wasn't just something people carried. It was something that shaped them, whether they wanted it to or not. And Shaq had a choice. He could let this moment fester, could let the anger, the frustration, the injustice of it all sit and rot in his chest. He had every right to. Or he could do what so many before him had tried to do. He could turn it into something else. Shaq inhaled deeply, then let it out slow. "So what now?" he asked, his voice steady. The room shifted. People exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke first. Then, Hank leaned forward, resting his forearms on the counter. "Now," he said, "this town decides what kind of place it really wants to be." The words hung in the air. Shaq looked at the diner owner, waiting. The man's hands flexed against the table. His face twisted, conflicted, like he was standing at a crossroads in his own mind. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. His voice was rough, but there was something else in it. Something real. "You start by telling the truth," Hank said simply, "and by facing whatever comes with it." The diner owner swallowed hard. Then, after a long beat, he nodded again. Shaq saw it in his face, the weight of a decision finally made. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Shaq stepped onto the sidewalk, inhaling the crisp evening air. The weight in his chest hadn't fully lifted, but it wasn't as heavy as before. Bev followed him out, her arms crossed over her chest. "You leavin' town?" Shaq considered it. Then, after a pause, he shook his head. "Not yet." Bev smirked slightly. "Didn't think so." From the corner of his eye, Shaq caught a glimpse of movement down the street. The young man, standing near a lamppost, hood up, hands shoved into his pockets. Shaq hesitated, then started walking toward him. The kid tensed as Shaq approached, his jaw tight, his posture defensive. "You don't gotta talk to me," Shaq said, stopping a few feet away. "But you should talk to someone. You ain't your old man. You get to choose what comes next." The young man's throat worked as he swallowed, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked away, exhaling hard. Then finally, he gave the smallest of nods. Shaq held his gaze for another beat. Then, without pushing, he turned and walked away. Some things couldn't be fixed overnight, but sometimes they could start. The night settled over Millbrook like a heavy quilt, pressing down on the town, weighing on the people inside the diner. The streetlights flickered to life, buzzing faintly in the quiet, their glow stretching across the cracked pavement like the past refusing to stay buried. Inside Edith's place, the air had changed. Not lighter, not yet, but different. Shaq stood near the counter, arms crossed, watching the people who had just hours ago looked at him with suspicion. Now their eyes held something else, uncertainty, maybe even guilt. But guilt alone didn't change things. Action did. The diner owner sat at the same table where he'd collapsed into his seat earlier, his hands clasped together, fingers locked tight as if he was trying to hold himself together. He looked smaller now. Not physically, he was still a broad-shouldered man, but in presence. And then finally he spoke. "I don't know how to fix this," he muttered, his voice rough. "Any of it." No one responded at first. It wasn't the kind of statement you could patch up with easy words. Shaq studied him for a long moment. "Then start by telling the truth." The diner owner let out a breath, rubbing his palms over his face. A man unraveling, a man unlearning. "My old man," he started. His throat bobbed. He used to say that some things weren't meant to change, that history was just what it was, that it didn't do nobody any good to go digging up the past. He let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Guess I believed that for too damn long." Bev crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "And now?" The diner owner swallowed, his fingers flexing against the table. "Now I see what it cost." A low murmur rippled through the diner. Shaq kept his eyes on him. "It cost more than you know." The man's lips parted like he wanted to argue. Then he just nodded. "Yeah, I see that now." Silence settled again, but it wasn't as thick as before. Something had cracked, a foundation shifting, however slightly. The front door creaked open. The young man, the one who had taken the wallet, the one who had spent his whole life in the shadow of a history he never chose, stood just inside the doorway, hesitant, ready to run if things went bad. Shaq turned slightly, watching him. Nobody spoke right away. The trucker at the counter stiffened but didn't say anything. The woman with the bun shifted in her seat, eyes darting between the boy and the diner owner. And then Hank, the old man at the counter, spoke. "You finally decide what kind of man you want to be." The kid flinched, his fingers curled into fists at his sides, his jaw tightening. His voice cracked, so he swallowed hard and tried again. "I don't know." Hank nodded, like he expected that answer. "Then figure it out now." Shaq watched as the kid's shoulders rose and fell with a heavy breath. Then, tentatively, he stepped forward. It was small, just a few steps. But it was a choice, a step toward something different. His eyes flickered to Shaq. He wet his lips. I don't want to be like them," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to be anything else." Shaq nodded. He understood that, more than the kid probably knew. "You learn," Shaq said simply, "and you keep learning." The young man swallowed again, his hands twitching at his sides. Then, for the first time, he turned toward the diner owner. The tension tightened again. The diner owner stiffened, his hands curled against the tabletop. But he didn't look away. The kid squared his shoulders. "You used me," he said, his voice raw. "Set me up." The diner owner flinched, looking down. He exhaled, slow and deep. "Yeah," he admitted. "I did." Shaq's stomach twisted. Hearing it out loud made it feel heavier. The diner owner licked his lips. He let out a breath. "It wasn't about you, kid. It was about me, covering my own ass, about keeping this town just the way it's always been." He shook his head. "That's on me, not you." The kid stared at him, his breath shaky, his whole body tense. Then, after a long, stretched-out silence, he said, "You gonna do anything about it?" The question hung in the air. Everyone was watching, waiting. The diner owner clenched his jaw. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yeah," he muttered. "Yeah, I am." The weight in the room shifted. A few minutes later, the diner owner pushed back his chair and stood. His face was set, his movements deliberate. Bev raised an eyebrow. "Where you going?" The diner owner inhaled deeply, exhaling through his nose. "I got some calls to make, some people to talk to. If this town's got a past that needs fixing." He hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Shaq. "Then I need to help fix it." Shaq held his gaze. "It's a start." The man nodded once, then, without another word, walked out the door. Shaq watched him go, feeling something stir deep in his chest. Not victory, not relief, but something close to hope. The kid shifted on his feet, still standing near the counter. He looked at Shaq again, then at Hank, then, slowly, at Bev. Bev let out a breath, shaking her head. "Well, kid, what are we going to do with you?" The young man stiffened, like he expected a threat. Shaq saw it in his stance, the instinct to run before someone could throw him away. But Bev just sighed and turned to the coffee machine. "You ever worked a real job before?" The young man blinked. "What?" She poured herself a fresh cup. "A job," she repeated, sipping. "You ever had one?" The kid shook his head slowly. Bev sighed. "Figures." She glanced at Shaq. "What do you think? You think this kid can learn how to wipe down tables and pour coffee without breaking anything?" Shaq raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Might take him a while." The young man gaped. You're serious?" Bev shrugged. "You want to do better, don't you?" The young man's mouth opened and closed. Then, tentatively, almost disbelievingly, he nodded. "All right then," Bev said. "Shift starts tomorrow at 7. Don't be late." Shaq watched the kid, waiting for him to reject the offer. To say it was beneath him. To say he was better off somewhere else. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded. And for the first time since Shaq met him, his shoulders didn't look so heavy. An hour later, the diner emptied out. leaving only Shaq, Bev, and Hank. Bev wiped down the counter, sighing. Didn't expect today to turn into all that? Shaq smirked. Me neither. Hank chuckled, shaking his head. Hell of a thing, history, he muttered. Always finds a way back, don't it? Shaq nodded. Yeah, he said, but sometimes we get to decide what to do with it. Hank raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. Shaq took one last glance around the diner, feeling the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't everything. It wasn't a full fix. But it was something. A shift. A start. And sometimes, that was enough. The neon sign above the diner buzzed weakly, flickering against the deepening blue of the night sky. The quiet hum of cicadas filled the air, blending with the distant rumble of an engine from a passing truck on the highway. Inside, Edith's place had finally settled. The tension that had once pressed against its walls like an unspoken rule had loosened, just a little. The weight of what had happened, what had been uncovered, still lingered, but it felt different now. People weren't whispering anymore. They were thinking, processing. And that was enough, for now. It was something else. Recognition. Respect. Maybe even gratitude. Hank, the old man at the counter, leaned back on his stool, coffee cup in hand. His expression was unreadable, but there was something knowing in his eyes, something that said, I knew this day would come. You always go around doing this? Hank asked, raising a brow. Shaq smirked. Doing what? Hank shrugged. Wandering into places, cracking them open like old houses full of ghosts. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Not on purpose. Hank studied him for a moment, then lifted his cup in a slow, deliberate salute. Well, he muttered, you did something here. More than most have in a long time. Shaq held his gaze, nodding once. No need for extra words. They understood each other. The bell above the door jingled as it swung open, letting in a warm gust of air from outside. Shaq turned, and there stood Bev, the waitress. She wasn't in her apron anymore. She had a denim jacket pulled over her uniform, her hair let down for the first time that night. But it wasn't her appearance that had changed. It was her expression. There was something softer there, less guarded. She hesitated before stepping forward, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets like she wasn't sure how to say what she needed to. Shaq waited, giving her the space. Finally, she exhaled and said, I was wrong about you. Shaq didn't respond right away. He let her say what she needed to say. Bev let out a dry chuckle, shaking her head. Not just you, though. About a lot of things. She rubbed the back of her neck, glancing toward the empty booths. I grew up here, you know. Was raised to believe things I never really questioned. People in towns like this, we don't always think we got a problem. Not till someone makes us look at it. She met his eyes again, her gaze steady. And you did. Shaq nodded slowly. I didn't do it alone. Bev smirked at that. Yeah, well, you sure as hell started something. She hesitated, then reached out a hand. Shaq looked at it, then took it in a firm shake. She gave him a small, almost grateful smile. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the night. Across the diner, near the entrance, the young man stood by the window. He had his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, but this time, he didn't look like he wanted to run. Shaq walked over, stopping just a few feet away. The kid shifted, exhaling sharply. You really leavin'? Shaq nodded. Yeah, the young man swallowed. Kinda feels like you just got here. Shaq studied him for a moment. Feels like you're just starting too. The kid looked down, toeing the floor with his shoe. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, like he was working through something big, something he wasn't used to saying out loud. Finally, he spoke. I don't know if I can fix it, he admitted. All of it. What I've done, where I come from, what people think when they look at me. Shaq nodded slowly. You can't. The kid blinked, startled by the honesty. Shaq leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. You can't fix everything, but you can fix what comes next. The kid exhaled hard, his gaze flickering to the counter where the diner owner had sat earlier. People ain't gonna forget what I did, he muttered. No, Shaq agreed. But what you do now, that's what they'll remember the most. The kid's jaw tightened. Then slowly, he nodded. It wasn't an answer. Not really, but it was a decision, a step in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. Shaq stepped outside, the air warm and thick with the scent of asphalt and distant pine. His SUV was parked where he left it, dust from the road still clinging to the tires. He pulled open the door, pausing for a brief moment to glance back toward the diner. The neon sign still flickered, buzzing weakly. But somehow it looked different now. Like it wasn't just trying to hold on, like it had a reason to keep shining. He climbed into the driver's seat, the engine rumbling to life beneath him. As he pulled out onto the highway, he caught sight of Hank standing outside the diner, watching him go. The old man lifted his coffee cup once more. A silent farewell. Shaq nodded back, pressing his foot to the gas, the open road stretching wide ahead. He didn't know where he'd stop next, didn't know what town he'd roll into, what stories were waiting just beneath the surface. But he knew one thing. Millbrook wasn't the same place it had been when he arrived. And maybe, just maybe, it never would be again. Some stories aren't just told, they're felt. Truth, history, and redemption don't come easy. But they start with a conversation, a moment, a choice. What would you have done in that diner? The road doesn't end here. It's just the beginning. Stay with us. More stories are waiting. Stories are